Hello and welcome to Beta's autumn edition of Feed Fact Fortnight. The theme for this autumn is a balanced diet. The similarities and difference between a balanced diet for us and for our horses. And to start us off, I'm really pleased to welcome Elise King from Pure Feed tonight. Elise has a degree from Hartpury University in equine science and has a really hands-on approach because she went on to work after university at Liphook Equine Hospital as a nurse, and her nutrition started, I suppose, very much like all of us, in that she had a horse diagnosed with EGIS, which really opened her eyes to the gap between industry knowledge and research, and her time at university really emphasised that bridge. So today she's passionate about trying to educate the average horse owner, of which there's an awful lot of us, on how their horse's digestion actually works and what's the best approach to feeding. So the theme we've got this year is really key because we're talking about a balanced diet. And Elise, welcome, and thanks for joining us. A lot of people out there like me will have their horses at grass. And so why does that pose a challenge for the balanced diet, and what role does the grazing play?
So the UK grass is really good. It is primarily a ryegrass. It grows really fast. So our farmers love it. You get really good yields from it. It grows really fast. But for us as horse owners, it actually has quite a bad nutritional diversity. It's quite monoculture. It's also quite high in sugar. So I know particularly for us who are looking to limit the amount of sugar our horses have, especially if we have issues like laminitis or EMS, it's actually not a great choice for our grazing. If we look at kind of horses in the wild, they were traveling for miles and miles each day. They were picking at different types of grass. They were picking at shrubs. They were picking at herbs. Whereas we have almost got our horses in a locked monoculture where they're in quite a small field. They aren't having that diversity. Particularly our fields, we lack quite a lot of different nutrients like magnesium, copper, zinc. So it really highlights the gap that they have in their nutritional diet. There are quite a lot of different things people can look at doing. I would very much start with looking at different types of balancers, whether that be a pelleted balancer, a supplemented balancer, but other people tend to have a look at rotating their fields, which can be quite a good choice, letting different diversity grow over time, or planting different types of seeds can be quite a good one. There's quite a lot of research out there now on what types of seeds and grasses are quite beneficial, or different types of shrubs you can put in your field.
And what do you mean when you say monoculture? Does that mean that there's very little diversity?
Yes, sorry. So that would mean, very little diversity within your field. You're going to have maybe one type of grass in your field, maybe maximum 2 or 3. So if you think that's like us, we're only eating one type of our food group, we're maybe just eating broccoli all the time, or we're maybe just eating chips all the time. We're not getting that balanced diet. We're not getting the different types of grass, the different types of shrubbery, different types of herb that horses would be used to in the field, out in the wild.
It's a really good comparison, thinking about only being on a diet of broccoli. But not only is it very boring, it's also very limiting in nutrients.
Exactly. It's so difficult.
I mean, at this time of year as well, I know a lot of people keep their horses out, or if they're not lucky enough to have enough land, they do have to bring them in. So how does that pose its own challenges for people in trying to keep that diet balanced?
Yeah, of course. So when you start bringing a horse in, not only are you changing their routine, which can pose its own myriad of issues, you're also looking at issues with different types of respiratory issues. So when you bring your horse in, they're suddenly in a much smaller space. So you're looking at things like different types of respiratory issues, from dust in the hay, or just dust in the bedding. That's quite a big issue when you're coming in from the field into, maybe being in a lot more during the day or coming in overnight, which can really exacerbate issues with horses.
And so how do you overcome that? What sort of things can you do to try and overcome those challenges?
So just looking at the bedding type of things, obviously there are lots of different bedding brands you can look out there for that will have different types of dust ratings. But from a nutritional point of view, it would be looking at things like soaking your hay or steaming your hay. Soaking hay is particularly important, obviously, for horses that have got weight issues. When you're soaking your hay, you are removing quite a lot of the content in the hay. Not only are you removing a calorie content, you're removing a water soluble carbohydrate content, which to me and you is the sugar and starch content in the hay, which is great for horses with EMS or laminitis, or those horses that really need to have that sugar controlled diet. You would be looking at about 30 to an hour's soak time, 30 minutes to an hour, that is. If you wanted to do a very, very light soak, if you wanted to only remove a very small portion of what is in the hay, it's quite good, therefore, for just removing the dust aspect. But if you had a horse that you were very, very concerned of, you would be looking anywhere up to 10 hours per day. And what I tend to really recommend is when you do remove your hay out from the water, is letting it, number one, hosing it off just to remove that the water that it's been sat in, because that itself is quite sugary, and then allowing it time to dry before feeding it to your horse.
So you
one
can
thing
let soak,
sorry.
no, I was going to say you can let soaked hay dry.
You will not dry per se, just to not feed it soaking wet, just because that can cause a lot of different issues, but you do not want to encourage that second fermentation of the hay. And then one point I was going to also bring up is when you are leaching out that water soluble carbohydrate, those sugar and starch, the calorie content, you do remove a very large portion of the nutrients that is in the hay. So you're removing all of the, although it's not the most nutritious in the world, you are still removing that content of like the selenium, for example, all of those nutrients that we maybe don't think about in our horse's diet, because we mainly focus on the forage and the fiber content and the sugar content, rather than those other little bits and pieces that do make up actually a very large majority of our horse's diet.
That's a really good point, because I think you're right. When we soak, to me, soaking is removing that sugar.
Exactly.
You do forget that there are other things in there as well. You mentioned steaming. Steaming is, am I right in thinking steaming's great for dust reduction? Does it play any role at all in getting rid of any sugar, or is steaming really not the best solution for that?
Steaming is great for respiratory, I would say. Soaking is the best for removing or leaching the sugar and starch content. I think a lot of advice nowadays is to do both, but as horse owners, I think that is incredibly difficult to manage. So I would pick the steaming for the dust, and if you had any particular respiratory issues, and then looking at the soaking for the nutritional removing of the sugar and starch and calorie content.
So having removed the sugar, which is great, and some of the nutrients, which isn't so great, how on earth do you go about putting some of those nutrients back in without the sugar?
Exactly. So that is where the balancer comes in. So just a little definition of what a balancer is. It's a really nutrient dense, whether it be a pellet or a vitamin and mineral lick or a supplement, like a powdered supplement, is a really nutrient dense feed that contains vitamins and minerals and essential amino acids. So it really fills in the building blocks of your horse's diet, particularly what you're missing in the horse's diet, without adding in unnecessary calories, without adding in excess sugar and starch. So it's a really good place to start your horse's diet from.
And once you've identified that, what forms do balancers take? I suppose I feed a balancer, it's in a pelleted form, and I know the quantity you feed is a lot less than you would a comparable hard feed. So what forms do balancers come in? How can you balance that diet with
Yeah, of
balancer?
course. So I would say if you're not feeding any hard feed at all, a pelleted balancer is the place you're going to want to start, just because it is a very low calorie option. You aren't having to feed anything extra. Most pelleted balancers are usually within a cup or 2 cups, so it's a very small quantity. You can do that in one feed a day, and you're not having to add anything extra. Or if you have a hard feed that you are already feeding, you can quite often find a powdered balancer. There are many on the market from both feed and supplement companies. Those are also a really good choice if you know you have a horse that is allergic to something that you can find in certain binders that people use to make the balancers with. Is a good choice to therefore look at a supplement balancer. And then you can sorry.
No, sorry. I was going to say, because I'm very conscious of calories.
Mm-hmm.
The owner in me wants to mix the pellets with something else, with chop. Do you
Mm-hmm.
need to, or can you just feed the balancer pellets by themselves?
So I can't talk for every brand, but I know certainly for us, you can just feed the balancer pellets by themselves. Most commercial balancers nowadays will soak into a mash. So if you wanted to not feed just pellets by themselves, you can add in a little bit of water and it would soak down to a mash, which makes that really lovely for kind of every horse. If they don't have very good teeth, or if they're a horse that just prefers a mash, then you can kind of mix and match how you would like to do it, which is a really good choice, especially if you have a horse, for example, that is being fed ad lib hay, or a horse that is on the a field at full time. They're getting their forage content and their fibre content already in their diet. You don't need to add in an additional chaff or an additional fibre product, because that is just the people who love horses in us who want to add that little bit extra.
Yeah.
But it will save both your money and as well as their calories by just feeding in a little pelleted balancer.
And how do you know if your horse does need a balancer?
Yeah, so what I would say straight off the bat is every horse out there needs a balancer. It's a really simple answer. Hay alone and grass alone is not going to be enough. So not only is our grass quite lacking in nutrients, our hay is therefore quite lacking in nutrients, because obviously that is where it's coming from. So a lot of the time people tell me, oh, my horse is just fed on hay and it looks really good, or my horse is on grass and he looks really good. What we're not quite really seeing is the differences that you could have if your horse was fed on a balancer. Some really key points to look out for would just be a general lack of shine. Does their coat look quite dull? Is their character perhaps a little duller than they had been? Do they have a general quite poor hoof quality? As well as, do they just generally lack, the ability to pack on muscle or top line, if that's something you're struggling with, or a general lack of an immune system, a really compromised immune system, can all be signs that your horse is lacking something in their diet. I know, for example, for quite a lot of us, maybe a balancer isn't on our first thought when we're looking at our horse's diet, but I think it's just one of those things that we necessarily sometimes just don't notice, these little building blocks that are missing from our horse's diet.
And so if you're talking about building a balanced diet, how does that look like? What are the key things that you need to consider to help ensure that your horse is being catered for from all aspects?
Yeah, of course. So I would say number one is starting off with your forage. As we all know, hay and haylage, grass are kind of the building blocks of the starting of your horse's diet. Looking for really good quality hay and haylage, looking for some good quality grass. We're looking at around 1.5 to 2% of your horse's body weight per day should be forage based in their diet. And then moving on, we should be looking at a balancer. So number two would be feeding that balancer to make sure whatever the forage isn't providing, your balancer will be therefore providing those micronutrients and the vitamins and minerals. And then number three, I'd also say, in terms of a balanced diet, although we would like to eliminate it, I'm sure sugar and starch does play a role in a horse's diet. You shouldn't look to eliminate that entirely, because it does play a part in the diet. It is balanced. It's just trying to not go too much over, and then I would say also trying to not go too much under the recommended amounts. And then finally, I think looking at super fibers as the fourth most important kind of cornerstone of your horse's diet.
And what's a super fiber?
So that is a fibre that is digested or fermented in the horse's hindgut far faster than a regular fibre like your grass or your hay. So that is things like your unmolashed sugar beet or sometimes your soya beans. They release energy far faster for the horse, and they're quite a good way to add into your horse's diet. For example, if they were lacking a little bit of weight, or if they were lacking a little bit of energy, they're a good place to start and turn to instead of focusing on a cereal or a sugary based product.
Oh, I've never heard of them described as super fibers. That's really interesting. When you talk about 1.5 to 2%, I think we all know that on a dry matter basis. But how do I know how much my horse is eating in the field? So I keep my girls out 24/7. I'm lucky we have reasonable amounts of grass, almost too much at the moment. But as they eat down and I start to think about, it comes to a time sort of towards the end of December where I start thinking, should I start feeding hay? Shouldn't I? How much are they actually getting? Apart from looking at their condition, which is key, how do I know how much extra hay, haylage, or supplementary fibre they need?
And that's a really good question. It's a really hard one. I do get it a lot. How do I know? And I always say to the owner, you're unfortunately the best judge of that as a starting point. You know how they feel under saddle, you know their base points, you know how they should be looking, and that's a really good starting point for an owner to whether or not they need to add in anything extra. I'm a really big fan of looking at body condition scoring and a lot of education around how to body condition score. Obviously, that is two different kind of ways of doing it, 1 to 5 and 1 to 9. And there's lots of different educational resources out there of how to do that, of to be able to tell whether or not just in weight terms your horse is a good weight. And then I think a good place is also looking whether or not your horse has enough energy to do their job. When you're riding them, are they getting fatigued faster than they have been previously in the summer when they've had access to better grass? Are they perhaps not performing as well as they have done? I think that's a good place to start looking at supplementing in extra hay to their diet, or perhaps supplementing in a hard feed to be able to provide them enough with what they're doing.
And I think the other question I always, and you hear people saying different things, in terms of the grass and the nutrient value of the grass. I know we want them to eat it for the fibre value and that sometimes the nutrient value, but as we get further into winter, if there is still grass on the field, does that carry the same level of nutrients as it would at a different time of year?
No, so when we have our winter grass, it's actually quite poor in comparison to our summer grass. Although this year has been a little bit of a weird year with how wet and warm it's been, we've actually had incredible grass this year. And I know, for example, when I've been out visiting yards, the majority of horses are doing really well this year, weight wise, or actually a little bit too well this year weight wise because of how good the grass has been. But when we come into winter, our nutritional content in the grass does begin to decrease, just as in terms with, with the horses going out on wetter grass, that unfortunately obviously creates more mud, which obviously destroys our grass content. And then just nutritionally, the grass itself is suffering, just in terms of nutritional content, just because of the terms of the weather and how the sun and the weather and everything else plays into how it's growing. So winter is a really good time as well. If you are considering to start feeding a balancer, it's a really good time to start, and it should continue throughout the summer. But if you want to feed a balancer at any time of year, winter is the best place to start.
Oh, it's really useful. And finally, just thinking about hay, controlling that hay intake. Are you a big, would you advocate people weighing hay?
Yeah, I think weighing hay is a great place to start when you're looking at your horse's fibre content. Obviously, there are different schools of thought with weighing hay. I'm a really big advocate for it, just because you then do know exactly what your horse is getting overnight. I know I've seen certain people, they really go for the double netting, which can be great. I think sometimes also investing in a smaller hold net and doing multiple hay nets around the stable is a good place to start. It really allows the horse to almost mimic their natural grazing, where they're moving around, they're not just standing there and pulling. Because I know certain issues can arise from, constant pulling, pressure on the neck. They can damage their teeth on the hay nets as well. So it's a real kind of fine tuning you have to do with managing your horse's weight in the winter with hay nets. That's something it's very difficult to do.
Yeah, I know, because mine have Edlib hay in big bales, and I do put a hay bale net over the top just to try and slow them down and to control the waste of hay. which they tend to trample into the mud. Because I prefer to feed hay from the ground,
Hmm.
but it's very difficult to control the intake.
Exactly. I'd say the
That
gold standard would be hay from the ground, but it's so difficult to control wastage. It's difficult to control the greedy ones who are going to eat it with all within an hour, and then they've stood there overnight with nothing. So,
Yeah, I like the idea of your suggestion of multiple hay nets. Not quite so
mhm.
practical in a big field, but I've seen some tracking systems which do precisely
Mm,
that with lots of different hay nets, which I think is
exactly.
a really, really useful way.
Hmm.
And it's been really, really interesting. So, just to remind us, what are those three building
Hmm.
blocks that really makes for a balanced diet?
So for me, those kind of three building blocks would be your forage, so your hay, your grass, your
Hmm.
haylage, your balancer, which are all those vitamins and minerals and amino acids, and then your sugar and starch would be your final building block. That is quite key to a horse's diet.
Yeah, it's really easy to think it's all bad, but I suppose that's exactly what
Exactly.
makes a balanced diet. You have a bit of everything.
Exactly. It's the same as us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's really key. Think of yourself and what you yourself would eat. It's nice to have
Mm,
chocolate all the time, some of the time, but you wouldn't want it all the time.
exactly.
Elise, thank you so much. That's been really, really useful. I think that's been a brilliant start to our series. It's given people a real insight into what does make a balanced diet and why it's so important for their horses. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you for having me.